Hi, everyone. I'm Weston LaBar. Thank you for joining us for another episode of People on the Move, a Cargomatic podcast. With me here today is Peter Friedmann, and I'm super excited to have Peter because Peter runs the Agricultural Transportation Coalition, as well as many other organizations that deal with imports and exports. And exports is really what we're here to focus on today, because over the last 2 or 3 years, exports have become more and more prevalent in both the supply chain from its importance, policy around the supply chain, making sure the American shipper gets their fair shake. And there's no one that's been pushing that more than Peter on behalf of America's farmers and the transportation network that supports them. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Weston, thank you very much. Thank you, Cargomatic, for doing this. You, both Cargomatic and you, Weston, have been very much involved in this whole campaign to get the world to recognize the importance of U.S. agriculture exports.
Absolutely. You know, I think where we might want to start today, Peter, is just a little bit of an overview from your perspective of some of the big wins we've had, not just this year, but maybe leading up to this year, that have got us as an export trucker, and you supporting all the export shippers, especially in the ag, the protein, all of our agricultural commodities. Talk a little bit about the imbalance that was taking in the supply chain and some of the major wins that have created what I think is a launching pad for the American exporter, as long as we continue to make sure that we're holding people accountable and getting export shipments where they're supposed to be.
Thank you. Thank you, Weston. You know, it's ironic, but there's a little bit of a conflict between the business and the political side of things. Ocean carriers put their ships in service to carry the cargo that we import from Asia. Pays higher freight rates, the clothing, the electronics, the shoes, furniture. That all pays much higher freight rates than do our U.S. agriculture exports, for the simple reason that the cargo is more valuable. It captures greater market pricing and so forth. So ocean carriers, none of them ever put a ship in service to carry our export cargo, which, as you can see behind me, it's things like hay, walnuts, almonds, soybeans, things like that, that have limited pricing power in the global economy because every country in the world produces and exports the same thing. With probably one exception, California almonds. You can't really get the quantity and quality anywhere else in the world. But anything else, from the beef and pork and soybeans and cotton, you can get elsewhere in the world. So that puts a lid on the market price that our exports can capture, and therefore a lid on the freight rates they can pay. So while the ocean carriers all consider our agriculture, and properly so, the backhaul for a routing that has already been put in service because the imports pay the sufficient freight to justify it. When our exporters are not treated right, who does Congress respond to? So when we had the supply chain crisis of the last couple of years, while the ocean carriers were getting $12,000, $13,000, $15,000, $18,000 a container for cargo coming into the country, they were sort of reluctant to have the ships waiting around to get a container load of hay that was maybe paying $2,000 at the most for freight. That got people on Capitol Hill upset. And of all the statements by all the members of Congress, motivation for enacting the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, I challenge you to find anyone who talked about the need to make life more profitable for Chinese toy manufacturers. Every single one of them was talking about their farmers, including a senator from Rhode Island was talking about his farmers. So everybody has farmers. Everybody wants to help farmers. And the Ocean Shipping Reform Act has in it, as the Shipping Act of 1984 did, specific language that the purpose of the act was to promote the growth and development of U.S. exports. It says nothing about imports. So every member of Congress who voted for the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and remember, it passed the Senate unanimously, passed overwhelmingly in the House 3 times. All of them were advocating for U.S. agriculture exports. And I think the ocean carriers have got the message. The economics haven't changed. There's only so much that agriculture exports can pay for freight. But I think the ocean carriers are much more interested in making that a viable business for themselves by improving efficiency of obtaining the agriculture products from the origins all over the country to the ports and on the ships and delivered overseas.
Yeah, and the Ocean Shipping Reform Act has been maybe the biggest thing that's happened since the original Shipping Act, as it pertains to the realignment of our industry and creating more balance for folks that have, quite frankly, been suppressed by the previous rules, right? And I know you've been part of the process. You did the update to the Ocean Shipping Reform, or to the original Shipping Act in the late 90s. Obviously, was part of the coalition that came up with the language and a lot of the rules, along with truckers and importers and really everybody here stateside. But on the policy side, it looks like we've got some paths forward, at least from a federal policy on supply chain. But there's so many other challenges that shippers face, and especially export shippers. Some are policy related, places like California putting zero emissions truck policies in place when you obviously have commodities that are heavy, that don't, first of all, the electric trucks are not ready to go. They're not ready for prime time. But if you're hauling an overweight container full of almonds to the port for export, you obviously can't use a truck that's in some cases twice the weight of the types of equipment that the export truckers would use. So you've got those types of policy issues. You've got the business issues around equipment shortages, right? You need certain types of equipment. If you're a food grade exporter, you need food grade containers. I know access to empty containers throughout the pandemic was a huge issue. You have labor issues, obviously, on the West Coast. Up until recently, you had all the ILWU issues. And I could go on and on, obviously, but talk a little bit about what maybe the biggest impacts have been to the export shipper. And then I want to get into really what the state of the industry looks like today. But I don't think everybody really understands that an exporter has a small margin on those shipments by and large, but at the same time has to jump through more hoops than most other participants in the supply chain.
Thank you. And you know the process in the supply chain as well as anybody, Weston. So I appreciate the opportunity to address this, very focused on the agriculture side. Look at our agriculture comes from places generally where people do not live. And our imports generally go to the places they have to go where the consumers live. So that means that you bring the import container in to a place like Los Angeles, or maybe you go to the Inland Empire, but you're always within a couple hours of where everybody's living, Los Angeles or Oakland and so forth. You don't have to go much further than 2 hours from any port in this country to get to most of the people in the country. Chicago, Minneapolis, you have to go a little further, but other than that, you just stay right by the coast. But the stockyards are no longer in downtown Chicago. Stockyards are in places, Denver, near Kansas City, and so forth. And dairy comes from places. So you've got to get your product from a manufacturing plant about 3 hours, 4 hours from even Minneapolis, places like Fargo. You've got to get from Junction City to dried dairy, from Junction City, Kansas. And where do you have to get it? You have to get it by truck from the plant to the railhead if you're going by rail. Then you have to get on the railroad, and you have to run it railroad all the way 1,000 miles, literally 1,000 miles or more to the port. Then it has to get into the terminals, which I consider a completely separate transportation mode, as you know, with the trucking getting in there. And then you have to get on the ship. When we started the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, it was all about the ocean shipping side. In fact, it started out as Agriculture Ocean Transportation Coalition, because trucking and rail, they weren't the challenge. The port operations weren't the challenge. The challenge was ocean carriers conspiring to keep pricing higher than the market should have allowed it to go. But in short order, it was very apparent. And today it is. Once you get it on the ship, boy, you're relieved. It's on the ship and it's out. But if you're starting in Fargo, North Dakota, or any place in Ohio, or some of the places in Kansas and Iowa and Arkansas, where all the protein that we are producing goes to the world, it starts there. You've got to get a truck, you've got to get it on the rail, and you got to get it through the port. And all of those have become incredible challenges. Now, one of our priorities from the outset has been to eliminate what I think is one of the most embarrassing components of U.S. transportation policy. We have, in key places such as California, such as Texas, the lowest allowable truck weight limits in the world. There is no country that restricts the truck weights to 80,000 pounds. Now, in the United States, it's a hodgepodge, as you know. So, for example, on the West Coast, Oregon and Washington allow 105,500 pounds with an extra axle. It's been that way for 25 years. Works great, less wear and tear on the road, safer. But California, where the mega ports, Oakland, LA, and Long Beach are, creates a wall because you can go at 105,500 through many states where agriculture comes from, but as soon as you hit that California line, you're down to 80,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. And we haven't even talked about the additional weight that all these batteries are going to impose. So you create massive inefficiency. Aside from the congestion on all the freeways that you all have to drive over there, where you have literally twice as many trucks on the road as you need. Because if you go up to that higher truck weight limit, you can get enough cargo on to eliminate one truck out of every two, get them off the road. Environment, apparently in California, they don't really care about congestion. They don't really care about safety. They don't really care about the environmental emissions, because if they did, they would join many states in the country and the rest of the world and all of Canada by allowing fewer trucks on the road, by having heavier weight. That is the key to so much. Now, unfortunately, our friends at the railroads like to have that cargo wall on the railroad and less on the truck, and they have been very effective in maintaining these low truck weight limits. That remains, however, a real key, because of that truck weight limit, you now have containers that don't weigh as much as even the ocean carriers would allow. So now you need more containers. As you said, the margins on our agriculture exports are so tight that we need as much efficiency as possible. There's a reason that some agriculture is now going places where you wouldn't think. You would think if our market, the best market for, or the largest market for U.S. agriculture exports, is Asia Pacific, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, now increasingly Taiwan. Those are our best markets and destinations, and our origins still are primarily west of the Mississippi River. You would think you would want to put it on a railroad, the Burlington Northern UP, head straight west to the Western Gateway ports, Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, and down to California, and straight across. But because of some of the inefficiencies we have, and you mentioned in California the threat of elimination of trucking, with the inefficiency at the ports where due to labor agreements and due to the California and now federal mandates that prohibit the use of infrastructure grant money for any equipment that leads or could lead to automation, people are having to find alternatives. the most direct route might be going straight west, but people are going south to Houston. They're going down to Mobile. The ship route is longer that way, and some from California are hauling product all the way to the East Coast before it gets loaded on a ship. Those are self-inflicted wounds that we impose as a country on our own economy and our own agriculture competitiveness around the world, because there's nothing we produce in agriculture or forest products that cannot be sourced somewhere else in the world. And we are pretty happy that it looks like the West Coast longshore contract will be finally ratified and we don't have the disruption, but we are unhappy but a big piece of that is a limitation or elimination of automation. And we don't know how you're going to increase capacity at the West Coast gateways, which agriculture definitely needs, without automation. How can you increase the volume capabilities? And our agriculture, as I said, cannot afford the inefficiency. If there's inefficiency, the foreign market will not simply pay more to pass through all those hurdles. They will just simply go to another country to supply it. And that's a challenge.
And you bring up some interesting points. The first is, it's been no secret that importers have implemented a four-corner strategy really since the turn of the century, when there was some of the labor actions in the early 2000s, and then really you saw the emergence of it after the 2014-50 protracted labor negotiations. And now, here we are yet again, almost 10 years after the fact, and you've got exporters really looking at it for a multitude of reasons, but it's really about trying to find a solution that they can count on, that is going to be reliable, and that they can operate within the margins that they have to make a profit, right? And so, not only here in California do you have the state with these issues. I mean, weight limits should be a federal issue, not a state-by-state issue. But, when I ran the Harbor Trucking Association, every couple of years we'd have to revisit just the local permits for the overweight corridor in Southern California, because someone would make a change which then made all the other ones non-synergistic with it. So you needed 4 permits, a state and then 3 municipalities, to be able to get from the port to a facility in the overweight corridor, right? This is called the overweight corridor for a reason, and I may be in violation in Carson, but I'm compliant with everything else. And so you even look at that, you would think our freight communities, our port communities would be looking at it, and they would be taking the lead, as opposed to, allowing for basically the gerrymandering of different types of policy that creates inefficiencies, and in some cases, to your point, complete walls for the shipper. And as a company that operates facilities in the overweight corridor, transload facilities for export, IMC and rail partnerships to move things, because to your point, that's the only way you can really move heavy things long distances is rail. And then going in and out of the ports, we've had to make some very, what I would say, proactive investments in things like quad axle tractors and chassis and whatnot, because you don't know what the equipment requirements are going to be that then essentially try to put logistics providers out of business down the road. So even within the microcosm of a 10-mile radius around the port, you have the same issues, maybe even more pronounced, and then they just proliferate around the country, which I think is a really great transition into where the state of the industry is now, because you talked about some of the hoops we've gotten through, right? OSRA policy. You talked about the ILWU, which it was great to be at the annual meeting of the AgTC, where the announcement was made, and Gene Soroka from the Port of Los Angeles got up at the annual dinner and said, "We have an agreement." I spoke with Secretary Sue, which, if you've never attended an AgTC meeting, annual meeting, there's always, for some reason, big announcements that seem to come out during that conference, and it's a really great opportunity to meet the players in this part of the industry. But where are we today, and where are we going from an export position?
We were, for a while there, getting more efficient. And then we've got another And that's the great reason, Weston, we love this job that we have, because it's always a new challenge that we couldn't expect. And you just talked about the four-corner policy, except now you have to light load a ship to get through the Panama Canal. So if your policy was to, shift from LA Long Beach to Savannah and Charleston and Norfolk, well, now you're maybe shifting back because you can't get through the canal as efficiently as you could when they allowed deeper draft. When there was more water. And by the way, CNN asked me what the solution is for the Panama Canal, and I think they were mildly disappointed that I gave them the answer: rain, more rain. That's the answer, and there's nothing we can do to make more rain there. But that's the sort of challenge that comes up, and now changes a little bit that four-corner strategy. So where we go from here is very interesting. We did see for the first time, as I alluded to it, almonds grown and processed within an hour and a half of a major West Coast gateway port, Oakland, being loaded on a train to go down to LA and Long Beach and then go by rail on dock, rail into LA Long Beach, which is, again, inefficient. Should be able to just drive to the local port, closest port, but even more so, loading it on a train in Oakland and going across the country on Union Pacific and then transloading to Norfolk Southern to go further to Norfolk. And nobody ever imagined that would ever be possible financially, but it's working. Now, one of our challenges is this. Why did that happen? It happened because there were two ocean carriers that were going from Oakland all water out to the Med and Europe. One of the ocean carriers decided to choose a different business plan, leaving one ocean carrier. And immediately the freight rates went up because they had no competition. To me, that's it. Where you ask, where are we going? We may be going to a situation there will be more routes, important routes, where there's only one ocean carrier. And you can see very clearly MSC and Maersk taking different approaches, different business plans. One wants to be the biggest carrier in every route in every place, and God bless them. I got to say, MSC brought thousands of additional empty containers to Oakland when the almond and walnut people desperately needed empty containers. And they have started a new service in the Columbia River, reinstated after 7 years of no certain container service. They reinstated that. But in some routes, including that all water, they're the only carrier. That's going to be an interesting challenge going forward. Maersk has a different approach. They want to be everything. They want to be the truckers. They want to be the freight forwarder. They want to be a customer. They want to be the warehouse. And I don't know if that's going to result in efficiency or just expense or confusion. We don't know. But those are two changes. And I think history has shown that the maritime industry likes to follow Maersk plans. So, which way is it going to go? We don't know, but that's two changes from the status quo. And, how many ocean carriers are going to be out there competing, and what services are they going to provide or not provide? And that's a challenge when you are, keep in mind, the backhaul. You are not driving it. You are not the Walmart or Costco or something that's talking about the store that's driving the ocean carrier decisions. You are taking what ocean carriers are doing for the importers, and you're taking what's left, basically. You're taking the backhaul. We have also seen a major soybean exporter sourcing soybeans, in Ohio and places like that, and shipping out of Norfolk, which makes sense, and building a transload facility, a major transload facility, which not the port providing it, not the stevedore, but the actual agriculture exporter building a transload facility and serving product that's origin west of the Mississippi, product that we always presumed would go would go west to the West Coast gateway. Some of that is now going from the western or central states and now going all the way east to get loaded, and ultimately getting on ships that have to go all the way around or through Suez Canal to get to those markets in India and Vietnam that are coming on pretty strong. So that's the third element, that the destinations are gradually changing. Vietnam getting stronger, India getting stronger, and the Gulf getting stronger. So that's a different destination and a different set of U.S. gateways to get there.
Yeah, and part of that, and last question on this one is, it looks like, at least for now, the inland port has become a big discussion topic again because of all the congestion we saw during the pandemic. And the inland port becomes a really big opportunity for exporters, obviously, because it creates, in many cases, a rail-served hub and spoke model to be able to potentially drop inland destination import cargo closer, in some instances, to where the exporters are, just because it's easier to build facilities there. There's land, the government policies may be more conducive to getting permits and getting things done. The rail seems very interested in investing in these facilities right now to overcome some of the shortcomings that we did see during the pandemic, having to completely shut down rail from a place like the port of LA Long Beach to Chicago. That should never happen. That's one of the, if not the largest rail, volume corridors that we deal with in this nation. But just talk a little bit about the potential that the inland port strategy brings to the exporter, because that becomes a great transfer facility and could potentially create more synergy with that quote unquote backhaul, not just from the ocean perspective, but taking it all the way from maybe a rail-served inland port directly to the dock with an on-dock rail service that then takes at least some of the onus that the exporters had to deal with, things like per diem on the container or demurrage because the ship didn't take their container, but the trucker had dropped it off because they were supposed to go on the container. Talk about that opportunity and what's the position of AgTC, because you've been a proponent of the inland port.
Yeah, and at the AgTC annual meetings, every time you've attended, we've sort of featured one, and we did Pocatello, Idaho. Utah's got one coming on. Kansas, around Kansas City, there's several in Omaha. Now, here's the good. The good is if there are containers there, they are going to be empty containers there that can be brought there closer. You don't have to drive from Seattle to Fargo with an empty container. And Lord help you, if it's not clean or quote food grade, what, you're going to send the truck back to Seattle or to go get another one and drive back? That's expensive. But if you can have the ocean carriers bringing containers to those inland locations, so much better for the agriculture exporters, because then they'll truck maybe only 100 miles to get a container, bring it back to the plant, load and take it. And then, as you say, it gets loaded on the train. And often that's the end of your troubles, because it gets on the train, and if it's on the carriers through bill of lading there, it'll go, it's the carrier's problem and opportunity to get that rail to go on dock rail into the port and on the ship. But there's a challenge. How do we get the empty containers to those inland sites? And we have challenges that we've been speaking at the highest level with the ocean carriers. It's still not financially viable to reposition an empty container from Los Angeles to Omaha. That is a long rail route without any revenue. Now, if it is protein, beef, pork, and it's going to be chilled or frozen going, there may be enough revenue on the other side. But that is still a challenge that we have to address. the successful inland ports are places like Pocatello, where Union Pacific says, we don't have to go any place different. We're already hauling empty containers back from Chicago and the population centers to the West Coast gateways to go out. And guess what? We're driving right through Pocatello with all these containers, the railroad, so we can just build a siding and they don't have to go out of their way. But that's if it's on the route. And they have that in Minot, which you heard this year with the inland port we talked about in Minot, North Dakota, where the Burlington Northern is going right through there. So they didn't have to go out of their way. That will require still the railroads to assume some additional cost, which they may or may not be able to recoup from the ocean carrier. So you still have to be moving a lot of containers around the country without any product in them. Ultimately, that's going to be the importer has to pay for that. That's because that's where the revenue is. So that's a challenge. But to the extent we can get state governments, as we have in Pocatello, as we have in Minot, North Dakota, as we have in Kansas, as you say, it might be hard to imagine living as you do and working as you do in California.
What the BN's doing with Barstow, they got away from the super local SCIG, Southern California International Gateway, that would have been built right down the street from the ports, and pivoted to Barstow, which I actually think helps a lot of the folks you're talking about and the folks that you represent, because, again, the containers are going right through there. They're repositioning empties from Chicago. All of the positives you talked about. It's also far enough from the port for them to put a unit train together, and close enough to the port where it's not that expensive for them if they have the customers committed. So, I think we've seen that with places like Greer in South Carolina. We've seen it all over the East Coast, right? The East Coast has done a great job of building these
every port on the East Coast, and
they have 70 to 100 miles away, right?
And the
70 to 100 miles away.
Yeah, and the states aggressively assist them with all sorts of tax benefits and permitting benefits and subsidies and so forth. Every single port on the East Coast and down in the Gulf have very powerful ones. And as a result, there are new ports coming on. You talk about agriculture export opportunities. Mobile, Alabama was not a big deal. But Mobile, Alabama, they are the gateway now for the largest Mercedes-Benz SUV plant in the world, which is up in Birmingham, Alabama. And the state permitted, and within a year, could you imagine, permitted and built a rail that shuttles those car parts up. So that's your inbound valuable cargo that justifies new service, ocean carrier service into Mobile. That's a good example. That pays for it. And then on the outbound, hey, guess what? All the Southeast cotton guys got another port, got another place to compete with Houston, New Orleans, and so forth. Or now they don't have to go to Savannah. They can go straight south, because they're the backhaul. And there it is. There are the containers. But I think we hit on it, Weston. If one wants to have a criteria for considering whether an inland port can be viable, I think you and I just now hit on it. The railroad has to already be hauling containers past that location.
Yep, exactly. So I know we're coming up on time, Peter, and I wouldn't want to leave without you having the chance to bestow some of your great advice on our listeners. So if there were three things from our listeners, whether they be exporters or people servicing exporters like ourselves at Cargomatic, what would the three things that you would recommend that they look at and or incorporate in their business or get involved in, right? I'll leave it very open-ended because there's a lot of things that we continuously need to fix, but give us your sage wisdom for those of us trying to help the American exporter or those of us who are exporting.
I'll give you something, whether it's sage or wisdom, we'll see, but thank you. And, for a lot of these topics that we've been discussing, where I get some of that information, my sage wisdom is I call Weston LaBar.
Too kind.
So you may hear some of this back again. First of all, I think operationally, we've discussed it just now, whether it's a local or whether it's a national move, long distance move, we always got to look for opportunities to marry up with the importer, import cargo. So that's street turns, for example. The efficiency that can result. And for that poor exporter who has tight margins, you're not paying for a trucker to go into the port and pull out an empty and bring it all the way out to you. But you can just take that container that's already out on the street because the cargo's been emptied and delivered to Riverside or wherever, to some Skechers or whoever. There's the empty container. Instead of running that empty container all the way back into the port, run it out a little further into California and pick up some cargo and come back. Everybody saves on that one. And so that's one. And then we talked about, if you're in Kansas or Arkansas, you have to find, or the railroad has to find some reason other than you, the agriculture exporter, to put that service in play. And so, and some people are being pretty successful with that. I was surprised speaking with a major meat exporter in the Denver area. They're now going to be loading right near their plants throughout Arkansas and Kansas and Iowa and Colorado, instead of trucking all the way to the West Coast gateways. It's a new strategy for them. I asked him, how can they get the railroad to bring the containers to those places? Well, he's got leverage, and they got a high value, high margin product. So that's marrying up. That's one. Two, we're back to it. If you got it, a truck brought it. We're still there. And we can be successful in changing the rules. I worked, the AgTC did. We've got, for sugar beets in Oregon, a place where the politics isn't that different from California, but where it's needed, 129,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. We had to be very selective on the roads, and that's a project we're working on all over the country. Find the roads we need. Don't scare the union and the politicians by putting them on the freeway. Find the roads you need that we can live and increase the truck weights. We've done that in Idaho. We've done it in Oregon, Washington, and Kansas, all across the country. North Dakota also is at 129. We can do it. South Carolina, we worked with the Port of Charleston, or South Carolina Ports Authority, to convince their legislature to go up from 80,000 pounds to 100,000 pounds. So they called on the agriculture community. We worked with them and the state legislature to increase truck weights there. And we are eager to do that all over the country. So that's another thing that we're doing. And finally, we join with all the coalitions and everybody else in trying to stave off these short-sighted, and I say short-sighted, efforts to eliminate diesel trucks and fuel consumption. And what's particularly maddening is that, at least in California, they helter-skelter enact all these new things. For example, you have to cold iron a ship at the berth in LA Long Beach. Good idea, less emissions, power the ship at berth by the electricity, and so they can shut off their engines and stop spewing stuff into the sky. But guess what? When it got really hot, people wanted their air conditioning. The edict came out, okay, go back to the fuel and spew the stuff out. We didn't really mean it. We just, if it's convenient, cold iron, but if it's not convenient, don't. And I worry with this latest one where they're starting to phase out diesel. Same thing. When they find there's not enough electric trucks to replace them, they're going to back off. For any business, whether it's a trucker who has to invest in that kind of equipment, or whether it's a farmer or agriculture food processor who's trying to figure out which will be the reasonable routes for our cargo to go, you can't have back and forth. Now it's on, now it's off. Now it's on, now it's off. We need continuity. So we join with a lot of the groups that you work with, Cargomatic works with, to instill some rationality. And I would say it might be frustrating in California, but I would say we got to keep it up because we've had success in Texas, expanding the heavyweight corridor around Houston, even though the state legislature in Texas is as bad as the state legislature in Sacramento when it comes to truck weights overall. But we were able to open the door a bit. So we're going to continue to work on it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us today, Peter. As the listeners can hear, a wealth of information, one of the most well-respected people in the industry, definitely the voice of the American exporter and the American farmer exporting the agriculture. And maybe above all is people should get involved, right? Go to the conferences, join the organizations, give your perspectives. I think that's one of the great things about the annual meeting is, and even the regional meetings you do, is people speak up. I have this many per diem invoices and I don't know why. Sit down with me, right? Or
what we do with AgTC, we have frequently, probably 30 a year. We have these workshops either in person, and we're coming to Fresno next, and we were in Omaha, and we were going to Boise, and we go to all the places the ocean carrier sales guys don't want to go to. We bring them there. But we have those, and then we have virtual. And there's a lot coming down the pike here from the Federal Maritime Commission that we're advocating better data submission so you can actually know when the ship is coming in, where the loading window is, whether there's going to be an appointment or not, whether there's going to be any opportunity to shift to another ship, just so you have the notice, so you don't have detention and demurrage. We had an excellent session a couple days ago, and frankly, the AgTC membership, a lot of people don't know this, is agriculture exporters and importers. They're freight forwarders, neutral freight forwarders, not divisions of an ocean carrier. They're freight forwarders and customs brokers and truckers. Years ago, Blue Diamond Growers slammed her fist on the table at one of our workshops in Stockton, actually, and said, I want my trucker in the AgTC, because the trucker is the only one who actually knows what's happening at the terminals and will tell us the truth. And so those are the three membership groups in the AgTC, and we encourage everybody to join us whenever you want to be part of the effort. Join us, and we do provide some benefits, because I think some of the ocean carriers listen to me when I call them up and say, this wasn't fair. You want to back off on this charge. Sometimes they're listening.
Yeah. Well, Peter, thank you. Cargomatic, proud members of the AgTC, proud transportation providers for the American exporter. Thank you for joining us. Again, Peter Friedmann, Executive Director of the Agricultural Transportation Coalition. Thank you for joining us. A lot of great information, and always appreciate catching up with you, Peter.
Thank you, Weston, for your leadership. Keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Weston LaBar, and for Cargomatic, this was another episode of People on the Move.